On September 11th, 2001, a number of hijackers from the Middle East attacked the United States, destroyed part of the Pentagon, and knocked down the Twin Towers in New York and killed almost 3,000 people, as well as crashing another airliner into the Pennsylvania countryside. We tried to explain this phenomenon in terms of the modern Arab and Islamic world. To the degree that we knew much about 2,000 years or 1,400 years of our own history and its interaction with Islam, some people tried to put it in this larger historical perspective. Most Americans just simply said, why did they attack us? And to the degree they thought further about it, they said, my gosh, we have helped Muslims when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. We offered them aid, we gave them Stinger missiles. And then someone else would pipe up and say, but when they invaded Kuwait, we went all the way over to eject Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Somebody else would say, but we went into Somalia and tried to feed the hungry. Somebody else would say, well, wait a minute. We bombed European Christian Europe and Serbia and Kosovo to stop the persecution of Muslims. We give Jordan, we give Egypt, we give the Palestinians hundreds of millions of dollars. Why are they doing this to us? Some intellectuals said, well, let me explain why they're doing it to you, because Islam is not working well in the modern world. There are structural obstacles within the religion itself to things like interest and banking and the equality of the sexes and an end to tribalism and based on a merit system. The notion of modern technology can be wondrous so that you can have chemotherapy or you can have text messaging without suggesting it challenges the primacy of the prophet. These were all explanations from the West to explain the inexplicable. That, well, why would somebody want to make a crater 16 acres in Manhattan? We didn't listen to what bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri, the two twin architects of al-Qaeda, had to say to us. In their exegesis, this was part of a long war from the 7th and 8th centuries AD until the present, in which Islam had suffered setbacks, but now they were beginning to set things equal. And I'd like to just review a little bit what Dr. Zawahiri and bin Laden were referring to. Islam itself grew up in the Middle East. I know today that 22 to 25% of the world's Muslims live in the Middle East, and the vast majority of them live in places such as Indonesia or Pakistan. But the Middle East was the great crossroads of religion where Christianity, Judaism, and Islam grew up. And Islam started as a religion of Arabs, tribal people. And remember what it said. It said that it was not a new religion, it was a correction. The archangel Gabriel had revealed a new doctrine to the prophet Muhammad. And this doctrine had all of the usual furniture that the Jews and the Christians were familiar with. There was an Abraham, as I said. There was a Jesus, but it was an improvement, and it reflected a new morality. And it began to catch on but after the death of Muhammad in 635. And I say catch on, what do I mean? There were three flashpoints where this new religion interacted with Western civilization, both in Byzantium and the new fusion of classical Mediterranean culture and European culture in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. There were three flashpoints. First thing that happened was, why did Islam catch on at all? Well, in some ways it patterned the progress of Christianity. Christianity filled a need in classical culture, a moral and ethical need. Now today we often say Islam burdens the person, the believer, with an entire way of living in which Christianity does not. You can go to church on Sunday and be a Christian, but if you're a Muslim, you must pray 5 times a day. You must go to Mecca. You must follow Sharia law. And this makes the religious experience total. It intervenes in economic, social, and political life in a way that Christianity does not. Maybe, maybe not. But in the original genesis of Islam, it was thought not to have done that. It was Christianity that was trying to indoctrinate people with a gospel that didn't make sense. Turn the other cheek. Blessed are the meek. This is not the way the world works. If you look at a hawk or a wolf or a jackal, they don't follow that rule. Men don't either, as Plato reminds us in the Republic. While there were far more rituals, perhaps, in Islam, there was a much greater semblance to the way the world worked, that men were dominant and women were subservient. There weren't going to be sects of Christian women, the equivalent of Christian women trying to claim primacy or equality. And there was something called jihad, or the idea that you can use force to spread religion. If you're going to go into a Christian stronghold, the people on the ramparts may have to ask for penance to save their immortal souls from a priest who will give them excuse to kill, but then they're going to have to say Hail Mary, or they'll have to wear a rough shirt on their back, or do something that was antithetical to Christianity. Not the Muslims. He's killing for a just cause. Jihad, war. At the same time Islam began to spread in the 7th and 8th century, Christianity had a crisis of confidence, because it was an ecstatic religion, but it also said that Jesus was going to return. Was he going to return 50 years after he died? 100, 200, 300? The waiting game continued. And more importantly, people began to think the problem with Christian dogma is that it requires us to be so pure that we better go out into a monastery, or we better have an ecstatic existence, or we better not participate in the civic life of the community if we want to save our souls. Save our souls from what? The dangers of alcohol, or sexual license, or money lending. Any of these contaminants can hurt us. So there was a great ferment in Christianity. Islam was much more directed. And as it began to break out among Arab traders, merchants, tribal groups, it said to them, you are not different than Jews and Christians. You are the natural succession to them. You have the same holy books, but you have the Quran, which is an improvement upon them. And you have a culture that's more in sync, so you can go to war, and you can feel that women are there to serve men, and you can feel that you can enjoy a wonderful existence by indulging yourself in a way that Christians can't. The first great casualty as far as West was Northern Africa. Now, Northern Africa, today we think Algeria and Libya and Morocco and Egypt. This was always Arab. It wasn't. From the 1st century BC onward, this had been incorporated. Berber tribes people, indigenous Egyptian people, this had not been an Arab culture. It had been part of the Roman Empire. It had been conquered, and it had been allotted as official provinces. And it was essential for the viability of the Roman system, because not only were these shoreline areas from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean quite rich along the coast, and it was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, but there were great trading cities. It was the key to sub-Saharan Africa. It was the key in the east to India, and these were the great trade routes. We're reminded in the historian Livy, you could eat a fig from Rome and it would be fresher if it came from Carthage than if it came from Northern Europe. So it was the highway, so to speak, of the Roman Empire. This was lost to the Byzantine Romans in the 7th century AD. They had reconquered it from the Vandals, and it became mostly an Islamic province by about 700. And across the Mediterranean into the Iberian Peninsula, Islam spread so successfully, swarm Iberia, that it was only stopped at Tours in 732. Let me just recap. Within the space of 150 years, a new ecstatic religion had gone all through North Africa into Iberia and reclaimed about a third of what had traditionally been Roman lands. And remember, this is very important, because if we listen to Dr. Zawahiri or we listen to the late bin Laden, we were told that Western interlopers had taken Muslim lands. But the fact is that Islam started out as a religion that overwhelmed territories that had been traditionally called Western. This great interaction would go on from about 710 to the final reconquest of Spain in 1492, when Christians overwhelmed Granada. It was the first great theater where the two religions collided. In the first 2 to 3 centuries, Christianity found that it had no answer, no religious answer, no military answer to this new religion, even though it had greater population and resources. There was a second element of collision between the West and Islam, and that was in the Middle East itself, the holy places of Jerusalem, the locales that we often read about in the New Testament and the Old Testament, what is today Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, the so-called West Bank. These territories had slowly been peeled away from Byzantine, Eastern Roman control, continually, serially, from about 800 all the way up until the 11th century. At some point, the Christians became scared, and there was a meeting between the Byzantines and the Western Christians that said, if we continue to fight, if there's still this schism between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, the result will be that you are going to be overwhelmed in Spain, and we're going to be overwhelmed in Constantinople. So we have to take the offensive again. And this was the beginning of the so-called Crusades at the end of the 11th century. For the next 200 years, Christians would mount 9 expeditions. The last 4 or 5 were not significant, but the first, second, and third were, and they resulted in the recapture of Jerusalem for 3/4 of a century and more. And the idea was that Western civilization would not take away new lands from Islam, but would say, stop Islam. This was traditionally A, part of the Roman Empire, and B, the birth of the Judeo-Christian religion, which is essential to the Roman Empire, and we want it back. Now, we often make fun of the Crusades. We make fun of the word crusade itself. But these people were not backward, shaggy, stinky Westerners who came all the way over miraculously and happened to meet sophisticated modern people like Saladin. Whether we like it or not, it doesn't sound very politically correct, but Saladin was not able to mount an amphibious operation that would take Muslims all the way up the Thames River. It would be impossible. So the Crusaders displayed a level of rationalism, military efficacy, knowledge, organization, logistics. It was quite unusual. And for almost 200 years, Islam and the West fought each other in the Near East. Finally, that would also prove successful to Muslims. The Middle East would become all Islamic in the way that North Africa had been all Islamic and the way that most of Spain had been all Islamic. There was a third area of conflict, and this was in Anatolia and Asia Minor and would end up in Eastern Europe. There had been a caliphate from 750, the Abbasids, all the way to 1250, where Islam was codified and organized and unified out of Baghdad. That fell in the 13th century, and there was a new group of Muslim tribesmen that came on the scene, the Seljuk Turks. They were nomadic, they were fierce, they were warlike. And from about 1350 to 1420, they overran most of what we would call Asia Minor and parts of Eastern Europe, the Black Sea area. Lo and behold, by 1400, Byzantium, Eastern Christendom, was surrounded. And in 1453, Constantinople fell. You could argue that it should have fallen earlier, but that was considered one of the great landmark days in the history of Western civilization. Within 20 or 30 years, Eastern Roman civilization in Greece, in what is now Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania was under assault. And so much under assault that Islamic Ottoman armies would twice get to the gates of Vienna. But for a golden moment, again, we're getting back into the mind of bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri. In a golden moment, this was even greater than the caliphate, because now you had an Ottoman religious empire, 20 million people, 1 million miles in extent, all the way from Gibraltar, all the way through North Africa, all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates, and the jewel of European civilization, Constantinople, the most holy church in Christendom except for the Vatican and the early Vatican, is Santa Sophia. Now it had minarets. Santa Sophia, the great crown jewel of the Justinian building program, now had minarets. By 1460, it was an Islamic shrine. And it looked as if there was nothing to stop this juggernaut. And I say nothing to stop it because what was Christendom doing in opposition to it? It was fighting. Remember, in the Fourth Crusade, Christians had diverted from their mission into the Holy Land and sacked Constantinople, never quite recovered. In the Christian world, there was a schism, and Western Christians had not come to help the Byzantines, and there was a schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. And now, in the 15th, end of the 15th and into the 16th and 17th century, there was another schism, and that was Protestantism versus not only Eastern Orthodoxy, but especially Roman Catholicism. So think of it for a minute. In 1500, the Ottoman Empire had unified Muslims in one cohesive system, whether they be Arabs or Ethiopians or Spaniards or Eastern Europeans or Albanians, and they were opposed by a civilization that was trisected into conquered Orthodox people for the most part, Romans who were fighting and killing Protestants, and vice versa. And this is the image that bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri wanted to return to. Why were our Muslim ancestors so united and so powerful and had driven the Europeans back and had cleansed them from the Mediterranean and drove them back inside Europe? Now, it never occurred to Dr. Zawahiri or bin Laden to say, well, it was an aberration because Europe was, as I said, divided and you were uniform, and that couldn't last after all. It was an imperial system. The Ottomans were subjugating Arabs, and they turned out to be far more harsh colonialist and imperialist than the British later would ever do. There were some problems with Islam under the Ottomans. This was the period in the West of the Renaissance, later the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and Christianity was adopting, modifying itself, rejecting particular dogmas, heresies, but also being liberated, so to speak, and more open to scientific methods of inquiry and rationalism. The result was that there was also a scientific renaissance, a scientific explosion, and an industrial explosion in the 19th century, and even earlier in the 18th. These ideas, which we today call modernism, were antithetical to the Muslim hierarchy. So if you wanted to build a lighthouse in Constantinople, or you wanted to have a university that could discuss something other than the Quran, then you were challenging the primacy and the influence of the Prophet himself. And the result was, in practical terms, if you're at the Battle of Lepanto and you have a bronze cannon and it is fabricated in Venice, you can shoot 500 or 600 shots and it will destroy a galley from Istanbul that has a cannon that's fabricated under Islamic auspices that might only shoot 50 times. Why? Because the science of metallurgy is very, very different in Venice or in the Papal States than it is in Constantinople. And within 50 years, you will have things like galleons and rifled barrels on cannons. And the Islamic world could not catch up. And with the opening up of the Atlantic coast of Spain, France, the Netherlands, especially Great Britain, which gave the West access to the New Worlds, North and South America, and much cheaper transportation, the Ottomans began to constrict. In other words, the Mediterranean became a backwater, a place where there were not new ideas of navigation, and there was not the great material wealth that was imported into Spain and England and France from the New World. The result was that Islam, by the 19th century, began to shed its imperial domain. And who did they shed it to? There were national liberationist movements in Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Slavic states, especially in Greece. Greece found its independence in 1821, and there was a replacement of Ottoman rule as far south as Egypt, and by the end of World War I, the sick man of Europe, Turkey, was abolished. The French and the British began to carve up the old Ottoman Empire, and that was pretty much the way things were until World War II. This is the world that bin Laden and Zawahiri were thinking about when they attacked the United States on September 11th. Again, right after the birth of the Prophet and the establishment of the religion and the codification of the Quran, Islam and Muslims had swept North Africa. They'd gone into Iberia. They expanded their influence through the Caliphate. They had resisted the best of the West had offered in a series of clashes through the Crusades, and under the Ottomans, they had codified these gains and had had a world empire that found itself at the gates of Vienna. And now what happened? Dr. Zawahiri and bin Laden did not want to accept what happened was that there was not a reformation Ottomanism and Islam in general did not seem flexible, did not seem willing to listen to new scientific methods of production, natural inquiry. It had a very different idea about the role of women, had a very different idea about meritocracy. It did not find itself conducive to constitutional government. The birth of the modern world was much easier facilitated to Christian lands and Muslim lands. They didn't want to hear that. They just felt that it had been sabotaged by two forces. Either Muslims themselves had not been pious enough, they'd been corrupted, they had not followed the dictates of the Quran, or imperialistic and colonial Europeans had been more evil, more unjust than Muslims. And the two together had resulted in the world of September 11th, 2001, in which Islam was not as powerful. Now, some of you are going to say, well, it must have been pretty powerful because, after all, they attacked the United States, and as we speak today, whether we're in Afghanistan or Iraq, a train station blowing up in London, Islam seems to be on the rise. Well, in the mind of bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri, there were certain developments since World War II that suggested that we're into a fourth area of conflict, a fourth area that's going to be even more intense than the flashpoint in North Africa or Iberia or in the Middle East, or with the rise of the Ottoman Turks. This new flashpoint is a phenomenon of about 4 developments since World War II. The first, of course, is that in World War I, but especially World War II, primarily Europe went into a period of mass slaughter. Between World War I and II, about 40 million Europeans, Eastern Europeans and Russians killed each other, and that weakened the West. Second, after the end of World War II, primarily by the influence of the United States as expressed in these new international organizations, most influentially the United Nations, the idea of colonialism and imperialism as practiced by the French and by the British was considered passé or even evil. And the Americans insisted that the post-war world of 1946 and 47 would look something like the world as it is today, but it would not look like the world in 1939. We felt that colonialism and imperialism, for some reason, had helped precipitate the war, even though you probably could argue that it had not. In any case, the result was the withdrawal of French people from Syria, soon from Algeria, Italians from Libya, British from Egypt, from Palestine, and there was a vacuum. So Europe had suffered enormous damage and casualties. Europeans were withdrawing from previously held Muslim lands. And there was a third factor that also helped this fourth renaissance, and that was the rise of the Cold War. In other words, the Soviet Union's empire, the global communism, found itself in conflict with the West as embodied by the United States, and there was a nuclear impasse. And that meant that the West could not exercise hegemonic influence, at least to the degree that the Soviet Union fell in its way. And whether we wanted to support Israel or we found ourselves in conflict with the Assad dynasty in Syria or in Egypt with Nasser, it didn't matter because these became patrons of the Soviet Union. There was another little twist to that, and that was that we were in a nuclear age. And so all of this conventional firepower the world had seen unleashed in World War II and now possessed largely by the United States and to a lesser degree France and England could not be unleashed in war because it might lead to a nuclear conflagration. We've seen this in Korea. The United States, even though it had enormous nuclear power, couldn't use it in Korea. So national liberationist movements, post-colonial movements in the Arab world said, you know what? Europe weakened itself in World War II. Europe has to beware of the Soviet Union and its nuclear deterrent. And for all of the impressive tanks and jets, they really can't use them against us because it could lead to a nuclear war, and we have a patron. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, you would think that the West would gain greater influence vis-a-vis the Muslim world. But what happened with the onset of globalization and the dissemination of knowledge, it became very clear that national liberationist movements, insurgents, terrorists had access to Western technology. So that a terrorist in Iraq or Afghanistan or Algeria might be able to assemble a bomb, and through terrorism and asymmetrical warfare, insurgency versus counterinsurgency, they could fight a dirty war that the West in its affluence and leisure might not want to embark on. Let me conclude. On September 11th, bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri felt that they were simply fighting a fourth war in the manner that their glorious ancestors had conquered North Africa and Spain, had resisted the Crusades and secured the Middle East, and had spread Islam through most of the East. And after World War II, there was a chance, an opportunity, if they were religiously devout, to take advantage of these new criteria and win a fourth war. Now we find ourselves in that fourth war, and I mean that literally, because we are fighting as we speak in Afghanistan. We have very extensive anti-terrorism protocols. There's an Arab Spring. We don't know whether it's going to be a fall or a winter that follows, and there's a new threat on the horizon of a nuclear Iran. In the vision of Dr. Zawahiri and bin Laden, we're into a fourth and final war in which Islam this time will complete the task and finish its 2 millennia struggle against Christendom in the West. For us in the West, who are pretty secure in our confidence in our religion and our culture of civilization, this seems lunatic. And anybody who would give credence to it seems lunatic. But for bin Laden and many Muslims throughout the world, it's very serious business.